You can't help but have noticed that for the last year or so, graphics cards have been something of an endangered species. The options for gaming graphics cards at £200 don't look at all appealing, and lower cost options than that basically don't exist. The solution, at least according to YouTubers, is the Ryzen G series from AMD. As someone who built their channel on recommending old, used GPUs for the Scalper Pandemic, it's hard for me to accept that an integrated GPU might be a better option than a graphics card in 2022. So for me, this video will either be an education or vindication. AMD have built a reputation for the quality of their iGPUs for over a decade now, culminating in the new RDNA 2-based cores built into their Ryzen 6000 series mobile APUs. For iGPU enthusiasts, however, it looks like, for a while, AMD were dragging their feet. Vega architecture, also known as GCN 5, is a couple of generations old at this point. Older Vega APUs like the Ryzen 3 2200G and Ryzen 5 3400G actually feature 8 and 11 graphics cores respectively, though using less efficient processors and operating at slower clock speeds than the latest models. That brings us then to the Ryzen 5 5600G. With only 7 Vega cores, we're probably not looking at a secret powerhouse chip here. You won't be getting rid of your GTX 1060 or RX 570. However, to maximise the APU's potential, I've done some tweaks and adjustments. For a start, I'm running on my usual test platform, the moderately priced gaming PC, and as usual, the CPU will be clocked at 4.6 GHz. The RAM in this system is usually clocked to 3600 with CL16 timings to represent some of the better value kits on the market, but for today I've clocked it to its maximum rated speed of 4000 megatransfers per second with cache latency increased to 18. I've also increased the GPU core clock speeds to 2400 MHz, up from the standard 1900. If you have a B450 or better motherboard, this clock speed should be achievable on even a stock Wraith Stealth cooler. I managed this on 1.35 volts, though as is often the case with overclocking, your mileage may vary. Without losing out on the console experience, it's possible to enjoy God of War at 30 FPS on the Vega 7. 1080 at original settings needs only the FSR Ultra quality setting enabled to see averages of 32 FPS and 1% lows of 25. For context, the GTX 960, a mid-range graphics card from about 7 years ago that's worth about £100 to £120 on the used market today, scored about the same FPS at 1080 without FSR, so this is a pretty impressive result for the iGPU. The Final Fantasy VII Remake doesn't fare quite as well as its PlayStation stablemate. The only real variables we have control over here are the resolution, texture and shadow quality. With these set at 1920 by 1080, high and low respectively, the game falls just short of 40 FPS on average. Dropping the resolution to 1280 by 720 gets FPS close to 60, which makes for a much smoother experience, though regardless of settings, this game suffers the occasional sharp dip during more spectacular scenes. It should also be mentioned that FF7 makes use of dynamic resolution scaling, so in order to maintain these FPS, visual quality can suffer dramatically. Alas, I didn't get further into Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy than an error message, informing me that a suitable DX12 GPU couldn't be found. This is, of course, nonsense, but GOTG requires more than 2GB of VRAM, and despite the APU sharing memory with system RAM, it won't allocate more than 2GB, and thus the game simply won't start. Forza Horizon 5 is a notoriously well-optimised game, though it will have some issues on older discrete graphics cards. Vega integrated graphics then are some of the lowest end GPUs that can get a smooth experience. At 1080 low, average frame rates in the canned benchmark came in at 55 FPS, and adding ultra quality FSR pushes them over the 60 mark. For those looking for a more aesthetically pleasing experience while sacrificing some detail and smoothness, 1080 high with FSR quality, effectively 1280 by 720, manages a quite acceptable 44 FPS. Plus, as is always worth mentioning, the canned benchmark is pretty much a worst case scenario for performance, and the game will run much better than this in general. Halo Infinite is one of the more unreasonably demanding games of late. If you just want to play through the story in single player and can tolerate a few flaws, this is kinda borderline playable, averaging in the high 20s at 1080 low, with the lowest resolution scale of 71%. Multiplayer doesn't see much higher frame rates than this either, and in that case, the frequent dips below 30 are much more egregious. Unless you want to run at even lower resolutions, I can't recommend this much. I've covered Cyberpunk 2077 in its own dedicated video, linked in the description, along with another video in which I test the Vega 7 in Elden Ring. To save you a click, the Vega 7 can run Cyberpunk at a little over 30 FPS at 1080 low with ultra quality FSR, but I've also gone into much more detail and tested numerous different FSR settings. You might also want to watch those videos to get an idea of just how much of an impact overclocking the Vega 7 and system RAM has on frame rates. I'm afraid I still haven't got round to playing Rainbow Six Extraction for real, so once again, this is the canned benchmark. Dropping quality settings from medium doesn't affect FPS by more than a couple of frames. At full 1080, medium settings gives over 30 FPS on average, and over 40 FPS using 75% scaling. The best result I got was 55 FPS, which was at 1080 with 50% scaling. I got the exact same results on both medium and low, and whatever the game's using for scaling still holds up pretty well, so feel free to use medium quality settings here. Splitgate is a lightweight esports shooter to be sure, but it's no Valorant, it's not a CPU benchmark. At 1080 low, the Vega 7 can push over 90 FPS on average, with 1% lows just below 60. A pretty decent experience, though you might wish for more, and it definitely feels less snappy and responsive than using a discrete graphics card. It might be possible to extract some more performance with resolution tweaks, but that's a subject for another video coming in the next couple of weeks. I'm always faintly surprised when Call of Duty Vanguard plays well on lower end hardware, mainly because of the other Call of Duty game on this list, which we'll come to shortly. In the meantime, 1080 with FSR quality and low settings comes pretty close to 60 FPS, and incredibly is only 10% slower than the GTX 960. I admit I'm not a fan of using FSR or other spatial scaling in FPS titles, as I find it affects visibility pretty heavily, but in this case I think I'd rather have the extra frame rate than higher resolution. I admit I'd hoped for better. Fortnite at Pro settings only managed an average of 80 FPS. This makes it about 35% slower than the GTX 960. Still quite a lot faster than the Ryzen 3 4350G I tested last year, though that was a different season of the game and not a direct one-to-one comparison. More FPS can be had with the performance beta render option, but I'm saving that for that other video I mentioned earlier. As Battlefield 2042 doesn't feature FSR or equivalent scaling, that means dropping resolution has to be done the boring way. At 1600 by 900 and low settings, the Vega 7 doesn't put in the most inspiring performance, just breaking over 30 FPS on average, and with heavy dips well into the low double digits. 720 improves averages to almost 50 FPS, but doesn't do much for 1% lows, or indeed for enemy visibility. Finally, I don't know whether it's the low resolution or I was just having a bad day, but I struggled to string together a decent length game of Warzone to benchmark. I might just fill the A-roll with a death montage. Anyway, at 67% scaling, approximately 1280 by 720, and low settings, textures actually loaded up for a change, and average FPS was only a little below 60. If you're going to do this, you should probably do what I didn't do, and that's turn off Filmic AA. The anti-aliasing solution makes the game very soft and indistinct, And while turning it off will increase jaggies, it might also help finding targets. Your mileage may vary, of course, and given the evidence on screen, my advice on battle royales probably isn't worth all that much. So, am I now a believer? Well, I admit it's fun seeing what humble tech like this can do with some adventurous overclocking and fast RAM, and in something small like an ASRock X300, this could be a fairly unique proposition. I'm intrigued by what the new desktop APUs with RDNA 2 have to offer, and once they become available, I'm very interested to try them out. In the meantime though, this is actually a pretty compelling APU. Normally, I'd be inclined to suggest a 6-core i5 from the last couple of generations and an RX 550 or GT 1030. But if you aren't the sort of person who wants to mess around selling their old graphics cards on eBay and just want to be able to drop in a new GPU when it arrives, I think I can safely say that if you keep your expectations low, the Vega 7 should meet them. Thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.